Welcome to Spooky Ass Shit. I am your host, Eric Dwinells. You guys, it is officially October, and you know what that means. It's finally time when nobody can give a shit about being into Halloween too early. First of all, it's never too early. Secondly, now is the time when the whole rest of the country gets on board and declares, okay, now you can celebrate Halloween. But of course, the real fans know it's not just one day. It's not even just 365 days. It's a lifestyle. I want to start this episode by giving a little bit of a warning. The episodes lately I felt were a little on the light side. I don't mind that. You know that the point of this show is to explore all things spooky, whether it's something terrible and horrible, a grisly crime, or if it's something like a kid show from the 80s. We'll talk about all of it. If it's spooky, it's for us. That said, for the rest of you, for those of you who are more into the morbid side, the taboo side, the dangerous side, I wanted to dip back into something that would be a little more macabre. And boy, did I find a subject that we could discuss together. You and I. Well, I'll do the verbal part, you do the listening part. Then if you've got something to say about it, you can write into spookyasshit@gmail.com. That's ass with 2 S's. Or you can find us on Facebook at facebook.com/spookyas. By the way, over on the Facebook page, I just announced a little giveaway that I'm going to be doing. If you share the page or a post from the page via your Facebook, I will enter you into a random drawing of the people who share stuff. I will select one spookaroo, and that spookaroo will get a care package direct from me from Salem, Witch City, Massachusetts. You have until Columbus Day to share the page or post from the page, and you will be automatically entered, and I will select one person at random from the spookaroos who share the love. You can also visit the website spookyas.com or spookyasshit.com. They both take you to the same place. That is the show's blog page, and you can find links to our other social media accounts, and you can find every episode there, including this episode, and sometimes you can find pictures and other fun things like that. However, I don't have pictures or video really to go along with tonight's episode, and you're going to be thankful, I think, that I don't. Because as I said, tonight's episode requires a little bit of a warning. Now, technically, this is a comedy podcast. However, I really only list it as a comedy podcast so that you won't be expecting too much. I don't take most of these subjects super seriously. I do crack jokes here and there. I'm not saying they're hilarious, but I do treat it rather lightly, and so do my guests. And so in that way, it's a comedy podcast, but we're not making fun of all the subjects or anything like that. So, all that said, tonight's show is about a very taboo subject, but I hope you won't let that turn you away, because it's actually, even though it's taboo, even though it's morbid, even though it's macabre, it's very interesting, actually, and I think that you're going to be able to handle it. Tonight, we are going to talk about necrophilia. People who are sexually attracted to human corpses. Okay, spookaroos, we ready? Here we go. Necrophilia is the scientific name for a person who feels a sexual attraction towards human corpses. To be considered a necrophile, you do not need to actually engage in sexual activity, but there have been documented cases where a necrophile has crossed the line from fantasizing about being with a corpse to actually defiling one. Necrophilia is classified as a paraphilia, aka a sexual fetish, by the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, the DSM, of the American Psychiatric Association. Now look, we've all got different things that turn us on. But can you imagine trying to explain that one to your date? Hey, I'm Sandy. I'm into long walks on the beach. I'm Chad, and I like dead bodies. Well, to be fair, they probably don't open with that. So the term has really only been around since 1850 or so, when a Belgian physician by the name of Joseph Gosselin coined the word necrophiles in a lecture about mental illness, with reference to infamous contemporary necrophile Francois Bertrand. This episode, the bulk of it, is actually going to be about Francois Bertrand. There were other cases that I discovered. In fact, one that I knew a good amount about because I had found this little... Well, I'll get into that in a different episode. Anyway, we're just going to focus mostly on Mr. Bertrand here and his little hobbies. And we may, if this episode does well, maybe we'll discuss other necrophiles in the future. Let's focus on the man who caused them to name the condition and see just how depraved you have to be before they name something after you. Before I begin his story, however, please note I am not claiming that this was the very first case of necrophilia ever in history. That's certainly not true. It's just the one that gave it its modern-day name. So with that, here's the story. Starting sometime in the late 1840s, the groundskeepers at several Paris cemeteries began to report a most gruesome problem. The sanctity of numerous graves had been violated. The bodies of the deceased were removed from their graves and left torn and mutilated on cemetery walkways. Wild rumors overtook Paris, and the stories and rumors grew wilder and stranger with each retelling. Many began to think that the cemeteries had become the feeding grounds of a vampire. They suspected this vampire dug up the remains of the dearly departed at night and feasted upon their decaying flesh. Policemen were added to the regular night guards at the cemeteries. Dogs were let loose on the grounds every night. The men never saw a thing, and the dogs never barked, but one morning 11 bodies were found to have been removed from their graves, dissected, and scattered all over the ground, some pieces of flesh even being found hanging from tree limbs. The fiend's nocturnal visits now seemed confined to the Cimetière Montparnasse. Did I say that right? I don't know. I took French for 3 years in high school and didn't learn a goddamn thing. On March 14th, 1849, a booby trap was then placed inside the cemetery. It was a small mortar loaded with all sorts of projectiles, including bullets. The trigger was connected to numerous wires, which were scattered in every direction. In the night, the machine was heard to explode. But when the police and guards went to investigate, there was no trace of who or what had set the trap off. The next day, a sergeant major from the French army by the name of Francois Bertrand sought admittance into the hospital of Val-de-Grace. He suffered from some strange-looking wounds on his back. It did not take investigators long to put 2 and 2 together. Bertrand was the vampire they had been looking for. Now, while he was in the hospital, one of Bertrand's surgeons obtained a full confession from him. And what's interesting about this is that this is the only time he gives a more or less full confession. Later on, when he speaks to police and in the official record, he doesn't go into the details that the surgeon says he went into. Anyway, here's what he told the surgeon. He said that his necrophilic impulses began in 1846 and were accompanied by headaches and heart palpitations. He confessed to desecrating the deceased not only in Paris, but all over France. His work as a soldier saw him stationed all over the country, and his frequent reassignments allowed his nocturnal activities to go undetected in many places. He progressed to exhuming corpses of both men and women from their graveyards, whereupon he would eviscerate and dismember them before masturbating. Now, He was arrested, obviously, but being a soldier, Bertrand was tried by a military court. He had a good reputation in his regiment, and his fellow soldiers and superiors all considered him a, quote, man of gentle disposition and an excellent soldier. At trial, he did not even attempt to deny the charges brought against him. He confessed everything with a strange and sincere candor. It all began, he said, when he happened to pass by a grave left unfilled after a coffin had been lowered into it. The grave diggers having stopped their work due to a sudden heavy rainstorm, he jumped into the open grave and began to beat the corpse, which he had exhumed with the tools left by the grave diggers. In the middle of this attack, the diggers returned to finish their work and discovered Bertrand. But he was an athletic young man and was able to escape the diggers and run into the woods. Hiding himself away in a ditch, Bertrand remained hidden in the woods for 3 hours in a catatonic state, overwhelmed by his compulsion and excitement. After this initial incident, he would go on to commit his crimes 10 to 12 times by his own recollection. And each time, he would exhume multiple bodies, sometimes up to 12 per night. He would exhume both men and women, though he preferred to find a female. When seized with his frenzy, as he himself described it, he said he would escape from the barracks and run into the cemetery, whose walls he could jump right over. Even when he knew police were looking for him and there were dogs sent after him, he could not resist the urge to return to the cemetery. He claims that one night the dogs did in fact find him and started to advance towards him, but he in turn ran towards them, which caused the dogs to slink away with their tails between their legs, never even raising the alarm. He claimed that in his frenzy, he possessed incredible strength, which allowed him to dig open the grave and pry open the coffin using nothing but his bare hands. He would remove the corpse, have his way with it, and either rip it apart or use his soldier's sword to hack it up. He would then masturbate over the desecrated body. Now, it's unclear exactly what he did to the bodies sexually and when he did it. Reports from the time simply refer to his more nefarious deeds as, quote-unquote, unfit to print. But I'm not sure I believe he simply cut up the bodies and masturbated over them. I mean, yeah, that's bad enough. But if that's just what he's willing to admit, I can't help but wonder what else he might have done that he's not quite able to say out loud. At his trial, he did have this to say about the time he discovered the grave of a freshly buried 16-year-old girl. I covered it with kisses, and I pressed it wildly to my heart. All that one could enjoy with a living woman is nothing in comparison with the pleasure that I experienced. After I had enjoyed it for about a quarter of an hour, I cut the body up, as usual, and tore out the entrails. Then I buried the cadaver once again. After committing his atrocities, Bertrand would run from the graveyard, search for some shelter like a ditch off the road or beside a river. There, even when exposed to the weather, he fell into a catatonic sleep. After his frenzies, he claims he felt, quote, worn and bruised for several days. The poor fellow. Bertrand claims that he knew they had set a trap for him, but he did not consider it an obstacle. His plan was to run up and simply kick over the trap without producing an explosion. Apparently, his plan failed. He was given the nickname of the Vampire of Montparnasse, which is ironic, since folklore vampires are dead people who return to defile the living. And, as one 1850 reporter pointed out, Bertrand's case seems the very reverse of this. For here we see not the undead rising to torment the living, but a man disturbing the peace of cemeteries in the most horrible manner imaginable. The court sentenced him to 1 year's imprisonment, the maximum penalty provided by the penal code at that time. Bertrand served his sentence and was released, claiming to have been fully cured. In his later life, he worked as a clerk, a mailman, and a lighthouse keeper. Surprisingly, reports from the time show Bertrand in an almost sympathetic light. They consider that he was mad or diseased in sexual deviance, but completely sane and healthy in all other areas of his life. One report from the time concludes by saying, quote, "Bertrand, the ghoul, is now perfectly cured of his hideous disease, and is cited as a model of gentleness, propriety, and good behavior." End quote. He died on February 25th, 1878. Now, of course, as I said, Bertrand was not the original necrophile. History has some singular accounts that pop up sporadically here and there. Written records suggest that the practice was present within ancient Egypt. Texts from the time say that in an effort to discourage intercourse with corpses, ancient Egyptians left deceased beautiful women to decay for 3 or 4 days before giving them over to embalmers. So you think, well, of course there must be laws against this kind of thing now. Maybe in olden times it was just kind of frowned upon, but now, modern day, there's laws about these things, and that's true. I don't know about around the world necessarily, although I'm sure you could look up your local laws and they might look at you kind of funny when you ask about it, but you can give it a shot. In the United States, most of our states do have laws against it, but not in my home state of Massachusetts. Now, of course, this brings to mind the more troubling aspect of laws. When laws exist, that means there's a reason. Somebody's done this. So, I guess in a way, maybe it hasn't come up in Massachusetts, and that's why we don't specifically have a law against it yet. On the other hand, maybe we should put that one on the books just to be on the safe side. Now, if it hasn't been taboo enough for you before now, here's where maybe the tide will turn. Because I want to talk about the fact that there might be people listening to this episode. It's not completely unreasonable to assume that someone who is listening to this episode right now has these types of fantasies. Now, hopefully the chances are very slim that they have actually had sexual intercourse of any kind with a corpse. And if you're out there thinking about it, please don't. Please don't. But if you're having these kind of thoughts and fantasies, chances are you're not willing to admit it out loud. It's not something you want to bring up because, of course, people are going to look at you like you're crazy. Even in the case that we just learned about, people were shocked because they said, well, he was normal in every other way, and maybe he was, but this is a pretty big but, right? It's not something you're going to discuss. So if you're having these thoughts and feelings, you're probably not admitting to them. And right now you might be thinking, Eric, you have lost your goddamn mind. It sounds like you're trying to defend these people even a little bit. Well, of course, I'm not defending the act of exhuming a corpse and fucking it. But what I am saying is that people might have this. And in fact, it's not as rare as you might think. And if you think I'm crazy, go to your internet box right now and look up stop time porn. Now, these porn videos don't depict people having sex with corpses, but they do depict people stopping time and then having their way with unsuspecting victims that remain completely still while the act is happening. Now, as uncomfortable as that might make you, since it's essentially a rape fantasy of sorts, it shows you that the fantasy exists, and in some cases, it's maybe not so much about a corpse, but about the complete control over somebody else. Just like everything else, just because you're having these thoughts and fantasies, that doesn't mean that you're going to act on them. This is a spectrum. And there's different classifications for necrophiles. So let's go through those 10 different classifications right now. A Class 1 necrophile might involve themselves in roleplay. These are people who get aroused from pretending that their living partner is actually dead during sexual activity. Again, I can't speak for necrophiles as I don't happen to be one. No, seriously, honestly, I'm not. But I think it's more about having complete control over something or somebody or somebody than actually the person being dead. But then Class 2, you have what they call, I did not make these terms up, these are what's out there. Class 2 is called romantic necrophiliacs. This is a bereaved person who remains attached to their dead lover's body. I've got a good story about a Class 2 necrophiliac, but we'll get to that on another episode. Then in Class 3, we have necrophiliac fantasizers. These are people who fantasize about necrophilia, that is, actually having sex with an actual corpse, but they never physically act on that impulse. Class 4, this is where it starts to get pretty damn creepy. Class 4 is what they call a tactile necrophiliac. These are people who are aroused by touching or stroking a corpse without engaging in intercourse. Just walking up and petting that body. Eesh. In Class 5, we have the fetishistic necrophiliacs. Hey, there's a new word I can't say. These are people who remove objects such as panties or a tampon or other body parts like fingernails or their genitalia from a corpse for sexual purposes without engaging in actual intercourse with the corpse. Now, this could be Jack the Ripper, maybe, perhaps. He comes to mind. He did take body parts. Now, number 6. This is a really long word. Let's see if I can get to this one. A Class 6 necrophiliac is called a necromutilomaniac. These are people who derive pleasure from mutilating a corpse while masturbating without engaging in actual intercourse with that corpse. These are getting super technical, and again, maybe this points to the fact that this is more common than we think, but that does sound like it could be our friend Bertrand. Class 7 is what they call an opportunistic necrophiliac. These are people who have no interest in necrophilia, but they'll take the opportunity when it arises. Hey, Your Honor, I wasn't planning on going out and fucking a corpse, but do you see how she's dressed? What was I gonna do? Class number 8 is what they call a regular necrophiliac. These are people who preferentially have intercourse with the dead. So, they'll still fuck you if you're alive, but they'd rather fuck your dead sister. Then at classification number 9, we have homicidal necrophiliacs. These are people who commit murder in order to have sex with the dead. Now this, you might think of Jeffrey Dahmer, and I think there's a pretty strong argument to be made for him being a homicidal necrophiliac. However, if I remember correctly, he wasn't so much trying to get dead bodies to get his rocks off with. He was trying to create slaves, and they happened to die in the process. So I'm not sure that he really qualifies. Class 10, the final class that we have here, is exclusive necrophiliacs. These are people who have an exclusive interest in sex with the dead, and they cannot perform at all with living partners. Necrophilia is often assumed to be rare, but no data for its prevalence in the general population exists. It is believed that most necrophiles only fantasize about the act without actually carrying it out. Due to the taboo nature of the fantasy, people are probably not going to admit to having them, but some researchers believe that necrophiliac fantasies may occur more often than is generally supposed. That's the point I was trying to make to you earlier. And I'll give you an example that I think might fall upon these lines. I went out with a woman several years back, and we were at the bar, and she said to me that she kind of, this is a quote from her, I swear to God, I'm not saying this, I'm not like some sexist, don't like write into me, this is what she said, this is a quote. She said, "I kinda want to be roofied." Now, she wasn't talking about specifically by me or anything, she just said that in passing. And then I said, "But what do you think you'll get out of that?" And she just said, "I don't know, I just kind of like the thought of completely giving up control." So, again, I think to me there's part of it that's a control element that is not really being discussed, that I think probably has a lot more to do with it than people think. Now, obviously, there's a big difference between being drugged and being dead, of course, but I think that the control factor part of it exists in both, and that's something to look at. I'm trying to be objective here. This is a weird topic, I'll give you that, but I'm trying to be objective, okay? So, in 1989, a study was released that reviewed 122 cases of necrophilia. The sample was divided into genuine necrophiles, which means that they were at a class 8 or higher on the scale that I just read off to you, and pseudo-necrophiles. That would be anyone in class 7 or below. Of the total, 92% were male and 8% were female. 57% of the genuine necrophiles had occupational access to corpses, with morgue attendant, hospital orderly, and cemetery employee being the most common jobs held by necrophiles. The researchers theorized that either of the following situations could be antecedents to necrophilia. A. The necrophile develops poor self-esteem, perhaps due in part to a significant loss. They may be very fearful of rejection by others and have a desire for a sexual partner who is incapable of rejecting them, and or they are fearful of the dead and transform their fear, by means of what they call reaction formation, into desire. Phase number 2, they say, or antecedent number 2, they develop an exciting fantasy of sex with a corpse, sometimes after exposure to an actual corpse. The authors of the study reported that of their sample of genuine necrophiles, 68% were motivated by a desire for an unresisting and unrejecting partner, 21% wanted a reunion with a lost partner, 15% stated an attraction to dead people, another 15% stated that they had a desire for comfort or a need to overcome feelings of isolation, and that the remaining 12% had a desire to remedy low self-esteem by expressing power over a corpse. Again, you may think I'm crazy for discussing all this on today's episode, but that right there, those reasons right there, I think are the key as to what's so interesting about this. How your mind warps in such a way that this is where you need to get your, I don't even know what to call it. I mean, these desires met, these needs fulfilled, even without it being about a corpse, just how does the mind work? Where do these things come from? That, I think, is the interesting part to me. And then you add the fact that it's such a fucked up thing to do. It's so taboo. Someone might as well be talking about it, and why not me? Because someday I'll want another job, and the employers are going to listen to this particular episode and be like, hey, we can't hire a guy who talks for 40 minutes about necrophilia. The authors of the study also said that IQs of the participants in the survey were somewhat limited, but not abnormally low. About half of the sample had a personality disorder, and 11% of true necrophiliacs were also psychotic. The researchers concluded that their data changed the conventional view of necrophiles as generally psychotic, mentally deficient, or unable to obtain a consenting partner. It should be noted, however, that the studies involving the subject have a very limited sample of the population to select from. Almost all study participants are sex offenders who have been caught. It is possible that there are many more out there who are simply not caught and who may have these fantasies but never act on it in any way and would never agree to take part in such a study. Now, seriously, what if you're listening to this episode and you are having these kind of fantasies? You haven't acted on them, but you want to make sure that you never do. What kind of help is there out there for you? Well, the bad news is I didn't find anything about how to deal with necrophilia in general, or specifically, I should say. But I did find some information on how to deal with paraphilic sexual interests in general. These include things like pedophilia or having a sexual attraction even to inanimate objects, that kind of thing. So generally, things that you should not be sexually attracted to, how do you deal with them? And here is what we have for you. Most psychologists believe that paraphilic sexual interests cannot be altered. Instead, the goal of therapy is normally to reduce the person's discomfort with their paraphilia and limit any criminal behavior. Both psychotherapeutic and pharmacological methods are available to these ends. Cognitive behavioral therapy, at times, can help people with paraphilias develop strategies to avoid acting on these interests. Patients are taught to identify and cope with factors that make acting on their interests more likely, such as stress. It is currently the only form of psychotherapy for paraphilia supported by any kind of evidence. And with that, we have reached the end of my notes on necrophilia. Again, I know this was a rather taboo subject to tackle on this show, this alleged comedy podcast, but again, I think it's very interesting. It's kind of like when you watch those like Inside the Mind of a Killer episodes of, true crime shows. I always find that stuff very interesting. I'm interested in psychology. I work around psychology and human behavior and triggers and all those kind of things. So, to me, this is very interesting, despite the very, very taboo subject matter. So, I hope you were able to enjoy it. I hope you found it as interesting as I did. And I hope that we never run into a true Class 10 necrophiliac in our lives. And of course, if you do have these fantasies, probably something went wrong in your childhood, is my guess. And you probably want to talk to somebody about it and really start the healing process so that you do not become like our friend Francois Bertrand and some other people that we'll get into on future episodes. In the meantime, again, please check out the website spookyas.com or spookyasshit.com. They'll take you to the blog page where you can listen to every single episode. You can find links to all of our social media. We are at spookyasshit on both Twitter and Instagram, and you can find us on Facebook at facebook.com/spookyas. Please don't forget there is a contest, or a giveaway, I should say, going on the Facebook page right now. You have until Columbus Day to enter, so please do that, and you can get a care package direct from Salem, Massachusetts. Which city? Yeah, I know I said Massachusetts wrong. I'm not going to go back and fix it. It's getting late. Next week, I'll be back with something almost certainly a little bit more lighthearted. And until then, don't be afraid.